In this video, we're going to talk about research design. You may recall in the theory building video, we talked about how when we get to the point where we've got the conceptual model, the theory itself, in place, that suggests hypotheses. And then I said, well, once we have those hypotheses, we have to pick the right design. So we're going to talk about design and research designs in the next few videos. And in particular, in this video, we're going to look at the sort of basic vocabulary of research designs. Some of these are probably terms that you've heard before, but we're going to apply them to social science just to make sure that we all have this same grasp on the vocabulary. So the first thing we're going to talk about is variables. In any research study, we have to decide what our variables are. And so the independent variable is the variable that we choose to manipulate. It's the factor we control because we think it's going to influence outcomes. So for example, a very straightforward variable sometimes is gender. And so we might say, does gender impact learning? So obviously we have two clear categories of gender. We might say male and female, although as our world changes, it's become increasingly clear that sometimes it's not just male or female, sometimes it might be transgender, so perhaps we have to have three levels. In any case, we would then have three levels of an independent variable. If we're saying, does your gender identity impact your learning? Okay, one level of an independent variable is male, one level of an independent variable is female, the third level might be transgender. So the key here would be that we're choosing that variable because the theory suggests that gender may play a role in learning. And so in this case, we would have one independent variable, which is gender, and three levels, which are male, female, and transgender. In our study, then, we can give different treatments to those different groups to see if it has an impact. What we will be looking at is whether that independent variable impacts the dependent variable, the thing that we're interested in. So I said, does gender have an impact on learning? We might say, does gender have an impact on learning science? Scientists tend to be overwhelmingly male in the natural sciences, not necessarily true in the social sciences. In the social sciences, psychology, for example, is now dominated by women. That didn't used to be true, but it is now. So the point is that if we say gender has an impact on learning, we might want to apply that to learning in different fields. So we might say, okay, the dependent variable is we're interested in whether or not gender has an impact on learning in medicine. And so we would want to control or manipulate the independent variable, in this case gender, to see if it impacts learning in medicine. Let's say we're interested specifically in learning about how that has an influence on the understanding of organic chemistry. And so the dependent variable is going to be some measure of organic chemistry. And so we're going to manipulate our independent variable to see if it has an impact on the dependent variable. So in this case, we're going to measure understanding, knowledge of organic chemistry, or ability to learn organic chemistry. A third type of variable is rather nefarious. This is the intervening variable. In all research, there are some factors that are sort of invisible to us or blind that we maybe didn't think about that come into play and influence experiments. In physical sciences, we do a pretty good job of narrowing those things out and eliminating those in laboratory settings. In social sciences, that's a lot more difficult to do because oftentimes, as we do in educational psychology, the research itself is being done out in the real world where we can't control all the factors the way we can in a laboratory. That means that there will be variables that we can't control or don't have the answer for that might influence our experiment. So what we have to do in a good theory is to try to identify what we think those intervening variables might be. So if we're going to do a research in a particular context, let's say, since given the example was a college level example, let's say that the context might be whether it's a situation in which the learning is going on and a setting where there's lots of light or a setting where there's only artificial light or something like that, right? Light might be an intervening variable that might affect the learning. So we want to then try to eliminate that as a factor. If we think natural light versus artificial light is going to make a difference in how that learning is going to occur, and it's going to mess up our experiment, then we want to try to get rid of that or eliminate that factor. We do that by making it a control variable. And simply put, control variables keep things constant. So if we would do our experiment in a situation in which there's only natural light, no fluorescent light, no artificial light, but windows and the learning is going on, then we've eliminated light as a factor. It can't be that there was artificial light in one setting and natural light in another setting that messed up the experiment, because everybody got natural light. So what a control variable is when we keep something constant so it won't be an intervening variable. So it won't have an adverse effect on the experiment. The next factor that we want to talk about are control groups. Not to be confused with control variables. Control groups are a key aspect of an experimental design. The basic design of research is that we have different groups that have different levels of the independent variable, and then we have a control group that does not get the treatment, that does not get anything. It's status quo, it's what would normally happen. Basically, the control group creates a baseline for us, so that as we manipulate that independent variable, the control group gives us something to compare to. And that's sort of the gold standard of research, is to be able to say that a research design is stronger if it's an experimental design because it has a control group. So when we're looking at research, we're going to look to see, does this design include a control group? If it includes a control group, it's going to be an experimental design, and we're going to be able to say some things about that research or know some things about it because of that control variable, or control group rather. The next factor we want to talk about, or element here, is dependent measures. So we talked about a dependent variable before. A dependent measure is the tool we use to determine what the impact on the dependent variable. So we were talking before about our dependent variable being understanding of organic chemistry. The dependent measure would be whatever tool, whatever test, for example, we would use to measure knowledge of organic chemistry. So the dependent measure measures the performance on the dependent variable. Another key factor that we want to talk about relative to experimental designs is our capacity to generalize findings. When we do research, and I talked about this sort of in the theory model, we want to be able to generalize our findings to the broadest group possible. But whether or not we can do that is really dependent upon the nature of the sample. That is, who are the subjects within our study? And we want our subject pool to be representative of the general population we want to apply the research to or generalize the research to. So the nature of the makeup of who's actually in the study, who the subjects are in the study, is going to make a big difference in terms of our ability to generalize. One of the classic examples in educational psychology where this idea was inappropriately applied is the theory of Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of moral development. This is the most famous theory of moral development. It was the grandfather of all theories. It developed the field, it guided the field, but it had one major flaw. In that study, Lawrence Kohlberg only studied males, but he applied the research to females, to everyone. So think about that for a minute, right? Does it make sense to do all of your research with males and then assume that that's accurate to apply to females? A lot of our experience would tell us that that's wrong. And it turns out to be a flaw in Kohlberg's strategy was that he did it. Now, if he only wanted to talk about males, he did lots and lots of research with lots of male subjects. He did longitudinal studies across time. He did cross-sectional studies, but he did them all with male subjects. So if he had not tried to generalize his findings to females, he probably would have been okay. But he tried to generalize his findings to females, which was an error. So in our case, when we're talking about research, we're looking at a research study, we want to look closely at what that sample is, that is, who's in the study, how that group was derived, and how closely that group then will fit the audience or the group that we want to generalize to. One of the things that I mentioned in the theory building diagram too was public dissemination of research and how critical that is. So when we are disseminating that research, if we, for example, overgeneralize the way Kohlberg did, the reason that that's going to be caught is because we publish that research and then we get called out about it. Somebody says, that's wrong. In Kohlberg's case, the most famous person who told him he was wrong was actually one of his former students who said, you can't do this. And she went off and built her own theory and became quite famous in her own right. Her name was Carol Gilligan. But that was about basically calling him on the carpet. But if he's not publishing it, if he's keeping all this quiet, then nobody knows. But if you publish not only your findings, but the research methods that got you to that, what did I do to get to these findings, then other people can critique them. So other people critiqued Kohlberg and found that that was a flaw in his design. That happened because of the public dissemination of the information. That also gives the opportunity to replicate findings. Another famous error that Kohlberg made was he did not publish the tool so the scoring guides that he used in his research to score how students did on these moral problems that he was having them do. And so nobody could replicate the study. The only way that you could do that was to come and study with him, and then he would teach you how to use the tool. Well, that's inconsistent with what we need to do in the field. We need to publish not only what our findings are, but we need to say how we did it, here are the tools, you try it. And so famously, Kohlberg did not do that, and so he was highly criticized, his theory again, why won't you let other people do it, because we can't now replicate your research. Eventually he did allow other people to use his scoring guide, but there was a period of time there where he just didn't, and so people couldn't replicate it. So it's hard to know whether the findings that he had were accurate or whether or not they were biased because they came from one research team. But if multiple research teams find the same thing, then that tells us something. That tells us that the reality is that maybe we're moving towards something, to real understanding